Thank you for waiting. This is our first Photo 2026 event. This will become a documentary about the history of photography. And John today will cover a decade of history of his work and the night climber. So round of applause for John, please.
I wanted to be a photographer from the time I was a schoolboy, really. I started off with things like Meccano and toy trains and playing around like that, and then somebody gave me a box camera. And to start with, I was fascinated by the mechanics of it, developing my pictures and printing, and I built an enlarger out of a few tin cans and things. And then I discovered the image, and I started looking at books by Cartier-Bresson, and there was an exhibition called The Family of Man that came to London, and I became interested in the whole imagery of photographer. So my parents felt that I needed to get a proper degree and get a proper job, as you might say, and wanted me to come up to Cambridge to study engineering. So I did this, but my heart was really in photography. And from the moment I got to Cambridge, I went straight round to varsity offices and got a job on the paper as a photographer. And it really started from there. I started taking photographs at Cambridge, first for varsity and things like that, but also I became the unofficial stringer for the Daily Express in Cambridge and started doing picture stories for magazines. There was a magazine called Queen that was going on at the time, and I did a story on the training the Oxford-Cambridge Blue Boat crew. And then I met some night climbers. And this was an extraordinary story, and nobody had ever really photographed it before. I knew about it, there'd been a book about it, but the individuals involved were pretty individualistic. They weren't a group, they were a group of individuals rather than a group. And I had a good friend called Timothy Green, who was a journalist who'd worked in Canada with Life magazine, and he and I got together to do several stories, and we decided that it would be exciting to do something on the night climbers. He had connections with Life magazine, and we talked to them about it, and they were very keen, and they gave me a big box of those old-fashioned flash bulbs like you used to see in sort of 1930s movies with a bunch of wire inside. So I was able to light up a huge area. So what we did really is we find a group of climbers who were going to do a particular operation, and I would go along and try and set up in a way that we could get good photographs. And it's not an easy thing to photograph really, because you have a lot of black and you've got the sky, and you don't want a lot of wires or cables to light things. So what I did was revert to the old-fashioned open flash technique, which is that I was hand-holding the camera normally so I could run away quickly. I would open the shutter and just hold the camera still, and with a signal my colleague would set off the flash gun, and then I would close the camera again. And so that was what they used to call open flash techniques. So obviously when you can see the pictures, or if we can see the pictures again, you can get an idea of how that worked. I was very careful never to push the night climbers into doing particular things. I would wait to be invited to a particular project, because obviously the risk is enormous of falling off or something, particularly something like the window of King's Chapel. So I would wait for them to invite me to a particular project. The most challenging of all, I think, was the Senate House Leap. I don't know how many of you know about climbers doing the Senate House Leap, but it's about 8 foot from Key's College to the Senate House, and there's a drop of about 4 or 5 inches down onto it, but then you have to go up the 5 inches coming back, and it is pretty scary. But I thought I'd finished the whole story, and one night I was coming out of the Arts Theatre, and one of the climbers came up to me and said, we're thinking of having a look at the Leap tonight. Do you want to come along? And I said, of course I do. So I went back and got my camera from the offices of Varsity, where it was, and rushed off to the Senate House. And I had a friend with a flash gun, but there was only one of the old flash bulbs left. I'd used up this whole box. And anyway, my colleague, the climber, went up there, and he went up into Keyes College, and we signaled that he was ready, and he did the jump, and the guy pressed the flash, and it didn't go off. So I, just at that moment, the police turned up on King's Parade with all their blue lights flashing. I think there were 4 or 5 police cars. And so I ran back down the Senate House passage, but they had me surrounded, and they grabbed me and tried to persuade me tried to get me to admit that I was in collusion with these night climbers, but I pleaded innocence and said that I was just on my way home, and I'd by chance seen these guys up here. So it's probably the same still, but the police don't interfere with college students. They just report you to the college authorities. And I went home for the Christmas holidays, and I was waiting for a summons from the authorities. But instead I had a call from my cousin, who was also J. Bulmer, and saying that he'd had a letter requesting an interview with I can't remember who it was now, but anyway, so I said to him, well, just, if you don't mind, go along and see what they've got to say. So he did, that and told me all their stories. So then I got my summons the beginning of the next term, and it turned out that they didn't really have any evidence. So I was able to confirm that I was just on my way home from a bit late. I was out actually after time, but they couldn't pin anything on me. However, a little while later, when the story was finished, we did publish one of the pictures. It's the one of the students climbing the window of King's Chapel, and it was on the front page of the Sunday Times. And that was at the time the Sunday Times was a broadsheet, so it was really big. And the college were rather upset by that, so I think they finally made the decision that they didn't want my company anymore, and they threw me out, but said they couldn't pin the night climbing on me, but they said they thought I would fail my exams, which I probably would have done. So I wasn't, although it was upsetting at the time, it was pretty lucky. So I then went off to London and went to see the Daily Express, who I had contacts with, and told them I was looking for a job. And they laughed at me at first. They said, well, if you set up in Cambridge, we'll use you. But I said, no, I'm in London now. So I set up as a freelance, and I kept seeing the Express. They were always very busy, and you'd be in the middle of a conversation, and a phone would ring, or conference would get called, or something. And on the third day, the picture editor leant over and said, well, actually, we're a bit short next week. Can you help us out for a day or two? So I turned up and kept doing that for 2 years. And so I really was taken on by the best national newspaper for pictures from being a complete amateur. So I was very lucky in that respect. And from that point onwards, there were other magazines starting in England, and it was a very fluid time then. There was a magazine called Queen magazine that we'd done a story for them on the training of the Blue Boat crew whilst I was at Cambridge. There was also a very good magazine called Town magazine, which was like an English version of the American magazine Esquire, and they started using pictures, and in a very strong way. They used the best fashion photographers like David Bailey, Terence Donovan, Brian Duffy, and then they also used photojournalists like Don McCullin and myself and Philip Jones Griffiths. So that magazine was really the start of something quite new in Britain. This is Book on the North. That's work later just to introduce me, but if you want to go to the first slide. This obviously, as you know, is one of the night climbers, and I'd actually thought I'd finished the rest of the story, but then I suddenly went into the office of Varsity newspaper and saw this was going on, and I went up into Keyes College. And the irony was that I didn't know this was happening in advance. It wasn't any night climbers I knew, and that they were engineering students as I was. But anyway, I obviously rushed up and took this, and the students had put it up there in one night, but it took the police 3 days to get it down.
So Martin Parr asked you, John. This is a question from Martin Parr.
Yeah.
When I went to see him last year in Bristol.
Yeah.
And Martin Parr asked you, quote unquote, how the fuck did you get the car up there? That is Martin Parr's
The answer
question
is
to you.
I didn't.
You didn't. But how, do you know how they did it? Like, was there like a process, or
They took it in parts, and obviously it didn't have an engine, and so on. I wasn't able to inspect it closely because the police and the authorities were there, so they did not allow me onto the roof of the Senate House. I just photographed this from Keyes College next door. But I was told afterwards that they took the engine out and they took it to bits, and that's how they. It's not a very heavy car, the Austin 7. So that's what they did.
Okay, next slide.
Right. This is the north of England. I was sent up to do the north of England, and I was amazed because I was brought up in Herefordshire, and I'd been working in London, and suddenly that industrial north was extraordinary. You got out of the car, and everywhere you looked, there was something extraordinary and exciting. And I found it was, in a way, I remember saying it was exotic, almost like going to darkest Africa that's exotic. And that it was very interesting. But I always felt, though, that my job as a photographer was to go somewhere and find something and come back with a picture that it was exciting and tells the story of where you were and what you were doing. This actually was from the second story I did for Town magazine on the Black Country, which is the area surrounding Birmingham. And this is the pub that they would go to every night, every Friday night probably. And the women and the men mostly sat separately. But it's interesting that they're all dressed up for going to the pub, unlike nowadays when you certainly wouldn't. The lighting was very low in those days, so this is actually done with a bounced flash, which I used quite a lot because you just put the flash shining at the ceiling, and it doesn't look artificial and so on, and it works quite well. Next slide, shall we try? Right, this is also the Black Country, just a random shot. I'm glad that electric cars had already started in those days with the electric milk float. Keep going, next. And this, I think this was actually it's another north of England country, but if you look in the picture, you can actually see me and my camera behind in the mirror. Can you see that? It was a Leica and a wide-angle lens. So in those days, I was really trying to work like Cartier-Bresson, as a fly on the wall. I didn't want to ask people. I didn't go up to people in the street and ask them if I could photograph them, but I would actually just do it. And one sometimes got into conversation with them, but the moment you say to somebody, "Can I photograph you?" then you destroy that image that's in front of your nose. Next slide. This is another one from the Black Country, and you can see now why it was called the Black Country. Your washing would come out pretty black when you... and it was the end of that industrial era. And again, I walked up to this lady and just started photographing, and she was perfectly friendly, but I never ever asked her if I could photograph her. This, as you can see, is taken with a wide-angle lens. At that time, newspaper photographers nearly always used what's called a Rolleiflex. It was a square box-like camera with a 6x6 format, whereas the magazine photographers on things like Life magazine, they would use 35mm and a wide-angle lens and a long lens. And I adopted this very early on. I wanted to get in and involved with people. And so I used something like a Leica with a wide angle lens, and then I would have over my shoulder a Nikon with a long lens, and I would tend to shoot wide or long, and I never really liked using the standard lens. Next picture. This is another story for the North. It was actually for a little magazine called Time and Tide. And they did a series of sort of centre spreads on industrial towns. I only had a couple of days to do that story, and so my policy was to drive up to a place and get out a 1-inch Ordnance Survey map and have a look at the contour lines, and to see if there was a way I could find the hills, so I could get my sense of geography. And I remember this place, I went up there for a weekend, and I looked at my 1-inch map and drove to the top of the hill, and as I got out of the car, that's what I saw. And because I was a newspaper photographer, I already had my long lens ready, loaded in the camera bag. I was able to take it out and get this one shot before he moved or walked off. But to me, this was just an example of grabbing an opportunity like a newspaper photographer would, and rather than trying to set something up. Next. This was, again, part of the North. This was a coal mine up in County Durham. And the extraordinary thing was that I was able just to wander in there, and they were happy for me to photograph them.